Hello, good evening, everyone. Right now, what we see is that there is a major escalation of conflict going on in Ukraine and Russia. The escalation, which primarily is a result of Ukraine actually attacking the bridge between Crimea and Russia. Now, that has set off a chain of events which absolutely is not going to end with that one bridge or whatever. And what we see now for the past 2 days is a pounding of Ukraine, not just the Donbas region. You have seen missile strike as far as Kiev and the other is the capital, and of course multiple cities in Ukraine. And we have also Moldova complaining that some of the missiles overflew its territory. So that's where we are at this point, and this escalation is worrisome. It is worrisome because we do not know from now or from here what shape and what turn the next incidents will take. And this is the reason why Frontline has had a cover this time on Ukraine itself and the war itself. And Stanley, Johny, and both Happymon, John have written as part of that. I'd encourage you to pick up a copy or subscribe digitally. We are at frontline.thehindu.co.in. Thank you, Happymon Jacob, for joining in. As most of you would know, Happymon has been with the JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, at the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at the School of International Studies. And his specialization and areas of interest include arms control and disarmament and India's foreign policy. Let me also introduce my co-panelist, Stanley Johny, who is with the Hindu, my colleague at the Hindu. And he has extensively written on ISIS and Taliban and all of that. He has, in fact, got a couple of books out. And he has also followed the Ukraine conflict very closely. So I'd invite Stanley to speak for now. And meanwhile, we'll try and get Happymon on board.
Thanks, Kay. Thanks for having me here. And thanks for the introduction as well. So the crisis, as as we have written in the latest issue of the Frontline, this crisis is now what you see, especially in the last couple of weeks, is a rapid escalation of the Ukraine war, because it started off as a limited conflict on February 24th. So the Russian leader mobilized some 150,000 troops, and then he apparently he was trying to make whatever his military objectives were through a limited war. But that didn't happen because Russia's military gains in Ukraine were very slow. Russia has still taken territories, some 15% of Ukraine's whole landmass Russia has taken since the war began. But at the same time, Russia also faced several battlefield setbacks in recent weeks, especially in Kharkiv and in the southern and eastern regions, some minor setbacks. But in Kharkiv, Russian troops had to pull back from the entire oblast, Kharkiv province. So this has, this has actually pushed the Russians to take an escalatory route, because what you saw that President Putin a couple of weeks ago, he announced the annexation of the 4 regions of Ukraine, Donetsk, Lugansk, and Zaporizhia, and Kherson. So, and by doing that, at least from the Russian point of view, the message he was trying to send was that Ukraine's border has been redrawn permanently from a Russian point of view. So if, let's say, theoretically speaking, on February 24th, if Mr. Putin was ready to settle the Ukraine crisis, with Crimea under the Russian control and autonomy for the eastern Ukraine, which is what the Minsk II agreement is all about. Now, when we are talking about October 11th, the Russians want more territories from Ukraine, which includes these four regions. So once the annexation agreement has been signed, so it is unrealistic to expect that any leader in the Kremlin to walk back on that. That would be politically costly, whether it is Putin or if you get somebody else in the Kremlin. So the crisis has actually escalated further. And then you saw the attack on the Crimean bridge. So from the Russian point of view, yes, from the Ukrainian point of view, Crimea is part of Ukraine. It has been taken away by the Russians. and it hasn't got international recognition, right? Only I think few of Russia's very close allies have recognized it. Others haven't. So from a Ukrainian point of view, or if you look at it from a moral point of view, Ukraine has whatever, Ukraine can target Crimea or the link connecting Russian mainland to Crimea. But at the same time, whether this attack bolstered Ukraine's deterrence, it didn't. On the other side, it provoked the Russians, which have enormous firepower, which still has enormous firepower. So you saw the next day the Russians retaliating, furiously, targeting Ukrainian infrastructure, military infrastructure as well as energy infrastructure. So by doing that, Putin was again sending a clear message that Russia still possesses enormous firepower. And if Ukraine crosses the red line, what he calls terrorist attacks in Russian territories, because there were a couple of attacks, right? One is this attack on the Crimean bridge, and then there was this car bombing in Moscow, which killed Dugina. Yeah. So Putin was saying that if these kind of attacks would continue, the response would be severe. So this also, the attack on the Crimean bridge and the Russian retaliation also marked another spell of, escalation in the whole conflict. The point is that I think at this point of time, what you see is that we all are on a very dangerous slippery slope, because on the one side, Russia is not making absolute convincing gains in the battlefield, which means Mr. Putin is, at least for now, he is ready to fight a prolonged battle. That's why he announced the mobilization of some 300,000 troops recently. And yesterday, the Belarusian leader Lukashenko was also saying that he is being threatened by Ukrainians, and that he would plan a joint military command with the Russians. So this is being interpreted as signals from the Belarusian leadership that Belarus might actually join the war from Ukraine's northern border. And if they do, the battlefront would be further extended to Ukraine's northern border. So in that case, if that happens, let's look at Ukraine's border. In that case, except the western border, which is with Poland, the entire border region of Ukraine would be conflict ridden. So that would not be good news for Ukraine either. So there are reports that Belarus is actually mobilizing some 150,000 troops, and Putin's 300,000 troops are expected to join the war. And then besides that, Putin is also now upping the ante by bombing Ukraine across the cities. So this all suggests that this is the war is in a very dangerous phase. Or if you look at it historically, I think this is the most dangerous moment in international relations since 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, Stanley, let me just stop you there, and let me just go to Happymon and ask for his views. See, basically, Happymon, what we have been trying to do here is, trying to justify why we are hosting at this point, because the conflict itself is close to 250 days, 260 days old. My argument was that the first phase, obviously, wheat prices went up, commodity prices went up, and whatnot. But it was not serious enough for somebody like India, though, of course, in restaurants, you saw that the sunflower prices, oil prices went up. So your favorite dishes, the prices went up. Wheat became costlier and whatnot. And in the second phase, what we see now is what is extremely worrying, this escalation, and where it will lead in a context where Russia and Ukraine are at war. So that immediately rules of Russia is trying to make any peace overtures. You have China, and China is more engrossed, at least for this week, with its CCP meetings and whatnot. And China has, as far as this war is concerned, has taken the view that Russia, of supporting Russia. US is too concerned with its midterms. They don't seem to be bothered. Europe, of course, is freezing and trying to make peace with whoever is there possible. Now, what role can India take at this juncture, seeing that this escalation is going to affect us all, and it is not going to, it is not something that is containable, because for every action, the retaliation seems to be something devastating that we have never seen before.
Thank you, Radhakrishnan. Thank you, Stanley, for your initial remarks, and thank you for having me on this program today. I think, to sort of answer your question, Radhakrishnan, very directly, this is probably not a conflict that India will be able to make any major contributions in terms of conflict resolution. I think this is being played at a very at a larger scale at the international system. So I am quite, I'll be very modest in sort of making any assessments about what role India could play in this conflict. Having said that, I think given the fact that there is, as you correctly pointed out, Radhakrishnan, there is a great deal of implication on that this war has on for India and countries in the global south. You're looking at a war, as Stanley pointed out, that is raging on. And from where I am sitting, the way I'm looking at it, there doesn't seem to be any end in sight anytime soon. I think we are in it for the long haul, as it were. So the more it lasts, the less it is, the more difficult it is going to be for countries like India to find a way out of the implications, as it were. Just look at the implications. For example, the economic impact itself. The rupee went above the 80 mark against US dollar on 19th of July from its value of 74 on the 24th of February when Russia invaded Ukraine. There's a lot of investors who are pulling actually funds from the emerging markets such as India towards the United States. For example, you saw the US Federal Reserve increasing interest rates multiple times in the recent months, and as a result, you're looking at capital flight from countries like India. Inflation, again, something that you pointed out. The inflation has actually remained about 6% every month since April. Touching 7.8 in May. So you're actually looking at a situation where there is very little conversation on what is happening in other parts of the world. You've seen this economic turmoil in Sri Lanka. You're looking at a certain situation in Afghanistan, which Stanley has written about. You're looking at the floods in Pakistan recently. How many actors from the international community came to came to the rescue of these countries? Very few, actually. So the reality is that in one way, one would make the argument that the broader geopolitical implication of the Ukraine war is that the global community is busy with that, with that particular development, and as a result, they're giving very little attention to what is happening in other parts of the world. And then there is, of course, this is the economic impact, as it were. Then there is the geopolitical squeezing, as it were, right? I mean, there is the pressure on countries like India to support one side or the other. That pressure, especially coming from the West. You saw very recently, for example, and that I see that as some sort of a signal to India. An Indian firm was actually, I think, sanctioned by the Americans for doing trade with the Iranians. This is probably a signal to India that if you continue to do trade with the Russians, you're going to be in trouble in the longer run. So I think there is a certain amount of geopolitical squeezing that is happening. There is the economic impact, and I think the lesson is very clear. The conflicts in the south are going to be not addressed at all. They're not going to be focused at all. Not that we want too much focus on some of these things, some of these issues, because focus actually brings sometimes a lot of damage as well. But I think the lesson for us, people in countries like India, is that we got to deal with our own conflicts in some ways. We can't sort of outsource our conflicts, our problems to the Western world, because when they get busy with something happening in their part of the world, they're only going to sort of put pressure on countries like India and not focus on the on the developing world or the developing economies. But I sort of want to end this sort of this particular intervention by saying that the war has actually complicated India's has actually landed India in a major geopolitical dilemma in several ways. And I have in my writings, including for the Frontline, argued that India's position on the Ukraine war has been evolving over time, definitely since India took a position in 2014 on the Crimea issue, but including from February 2022, we have evolved our position. But India is clearly facing a major geopolitical dilemma, as it were. But I can come back to that particular question, should you want me to, in my intervention.
Yeah, in fact, Happymon, I'll just come to you and then I'll go to Stanley. Since you are in this flow of detailing the impacts and the stand that India's evolving stand, which is the euphemism to say that we have been trying to beat around the bush. Now, there comes a point, obviously, when the national interests are above, moral rights and wrongs and international relations. You only have permanent interests and you don't have permanent friends or enemies. I mean, so goes the saying. Now, given the fact that 55% of India's military hardware comes from Russia, how difficult will it be for India to take a stand on this issue and stand by that, knowing fully well that the West will not support or give adequate arms and ammunition at a time when India will need, say, in a conflict with, say, Pakistan or any other non-state actors for that purpose?
Right. I mean, let me put it this way. There are several schools of thought when it comes to India-Russia relations. One argument is that India is speaking in different tongues. India is creating a certain narrative through its policy pronouncements, through its spokesperson or the permanent representative in the United Nations, and through various other briefings, etc. Engaging in a certain verbal jugglery, that if Russia looks at this particular set of statements, Russia will say, all right, I mean, there's nothing against us. If the Americans look at it, they will say, yeah, it's actually condemning the Russian action. If somebody else looks at it, he or she can sort of interpret it in his or her, in the manner she or he wants to. So I think at one level, one interpretation is that India is engaging in a certain smart verbal gymnastics or jugglery, as it were, so that each sort of listener can interpret it in his or her way. The other argument or the other reading is that India is actually moving away from Russia. There is a certain amount of language that is being used by India. If you look at the language about sovereignty or about dialogue on diplomacies, territorial sovereignty, condemning Buka killings, Modi saying something to Putin, one could make the argument that India is actually moving away from Russia, pretty quickly. I would want to sort of take a middle position here, and I would make the argument, and I have in fact argued in some of my recent writings, that India is actually moving away from Russia slowly but steadily, and this dependence is going to continue for some time to come. As you correctly pointed out, Radhakrishnan, at this point of time, you're looking at 50 to 55% of India's hardware being Russian vintage. So given that, we need the spare parts, we need continuous supply of some of this is going forward. But remember, between 2012 and 2021, India reduced India's dependence on Russian imports came down by about 47%. So a lot of other countries are now willing to export to India. There's a lot more consultation happening between India and the Western countries in terms of defense purchases. So there is that conversation that is happening. So if you ask me, why does India need Russia? Certainly not for oil. I mean, the current purchase that we are seeing is opportunistic purchases because of deep discounts. We need Russia for two things. I'm putting it very crudely out there. One, we need Russia for, as you said, the defense imports, and that dependence is actually reducing over time, and it will continue to reduce over time. If you look at the statistics, number one. Number two, India needs Russia because Russia has been a loyal partner, and Russia provides India the much needed support in various global forums such as the United Nations Security Council. So can India find another partner who could potentially help India in some of these forums, like the UN Security Council? Is France the answer? Are some of the other countries the answer? I don't know. But I think the thinking in India, the thinking will definitely happen about the need to have a plan B in that context, because we don't know how this war is going to end. We don't know how weakened Russia or not it will be at the end of the war. We don't know how far the Chinese will influence Russian decision making going forward vis-a-vis India. So I think India needs to look for plan B, plan C. So I think that thinking is definitely taking place. So I'm sort of still making the argument that this is a process, in my opinion, of decoupling from Russia that has started. How fast that will progress is something that depends on a variety of, I think, circumstances, including how this war unfolds.
Yeah. Thank you, Happymon, for that. It's extremely heartening to hear. And, I follow the neighborhood very closely, but I don't as much as when it comes to superpowers. It's very heartening to hear that there has been some thinking, and that's why the moving away from Russia to France or the other countries, for military hardware. Of course, it's another question as to since our dependence is about 55% on the hardware, it's very difficult to say how long this phasing out time will be. And if the West plus the US, which always act as a bloc, will be willing to help us in our times of need. I'll leave it there, this point at that, this particular strand here for now. Let me just go back to Stanley and ask him, Stanley, is there any comparable conflict anywhere? Since you've written on Afghanistan, you've written on Iraq, Central Asia, Central America, South America, and all of that. Is there any parallel where a war of this nature, it ebbs and it flows, and then it ebbs again, and it again has a peak? What happens next? That I think is a question that is in all our minds. And is there any parallels that you can draw from somewhere to say, give us some heartening thoughts?
Yeah, I think you look at this conflict, I would again say that since the end of the Second World War, this is the most dangerous conflict that is unfolding before us in Europe. So there were a number of conflicts since the World War was over. Let's say the Soviets went into Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviets went into Afghanistan. The Americans went into Vietnam. So in the case of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the Soviets managed to meet their goals quickly. In Afghanistan, they got mired in the conflict and they had to pull back. The same thing happened with the Americans in Vietnam. And after let's say the Cold War was over, the Americans went to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, etc., etc. But all these conflicts were more or less, these were conflicts between a great power and a weaker power. So a great power would go into a weaker power. The weaker power would be whatever supported by the great power's rivals, and there would be some kind of an outcome. Either the invader would manage to meet their objectives or they pull back. But in the case of Ukraine, what you see is the risk of a real great power conflict, because Russia's initial thrust into Ukraine, I think, Russia failed to meet its objectives conclusively and quickly. That's why in the 8th month, the war is still going on. And that opened up opportunities for the United States and other countries in Europe to, militarily counterbalance inside Ukraine. So the war which is now happening in Ukraine, for all practical matters, this is a conflict between the West and Russia. This is not just a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, because Ukraine may not be a member of NATO, but NATO is supplying weapons. Mercenaries are traveling to Ukraine to fight the Russians, etc., etc. So the risk of a great power conflict is very high. And then secondly, how long? What is next? That kind of a question. If you look at any conflict, how a conflict has to come to an end. Either one side has to take an outright victory, or there has to be a negotiated settlement. In the case of the Ukraine conflict, you don't see any of these chances, because if at all, let's say that either side is winning the conflict, that would, I think, take a long time, because Russia, despite its battlefield setbacks in the recent weeks, Russia has already taken some 15 to 20% of Ukrainian lands. So, from the Ukrainian point of view, if they want outright victory, they have to push the Russians out of their territories, including in Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, which is impractical, to be frank. I mean, we can say that Ukraine needs to get back its land, which is fine, but which is impractical because Russia, at the end of the day, is Russia. It still has, irrespective of the battlefield setbacks, it still possesses firepower, etc., etc. And then, even from the Russian point of view, if Russia wants to take over more territories of Ukraine, I think Russia is also facing severe, battlefield resistance inside Ukraine. They were forced to withdraw from parts of Ukraine, and even in the south, they were now facing limited setbacks. So an outright victory, at least at this point of time, I mean, I don't think that is feasible. It might, I don't know whether it would happen in the future, but it is not feasible. Secondly, which is the peace process. But you see, in March, after the war began, in the Istanbul talks, there were these proposals which the Ukrainians and the Russians discussed. So as part of that, Ukraine apparently proposed to have a 15-year consultative period on the status of Crimea, and to have direct negotiations between Putin and Zelensky on the status of Donbas. And the Russians had agreed to that proposals, and they had pulled back their troops from around Kyiv and Kharkiv city. This happened in March. But immediately after the Russians pulled back from Kyiv, these Bucha bodies came up, and then the entire peace process collapsed. So ever since then, the peace process hasn't moved forward. But now it's become much more complicated after the Russian annexation of the Ukrainian territories. Because the Ukrainians, at the end of the day, would want their territories back. Even if they are not getting Crimea, they would want other territories back, which means they at least would want the 2022 February 24 status quo, pre-February 24 status quo. But after the annexation, even that possibility has become very grim. As I pointed out earlier, any leader in Moscow to compromise on a territory which they think is theirs, it would be politically costly. So the peace process has become, the chances for peace process has become after the Russian annexation. So, but still, if you want to find a negotiated settlement, there has to be talks between the two sides. But at this point of time, the Ukrainians say that no, Zelensky had even signed a decree saying that there won't be talks as long as Putin is there. And the United States or European leaders also, they haven't, Macron is making some statements off and on. But besides that, the United States is also saying that, at least they are also not pushing for talks. So this is, from that point of view, this has reached, this is a dilemma for all sides. So I think, on the one side, you don't see a military solution, an immediate military solution. And on the other side, the prospects for a negotiated settlement are very grim and weak. And then there are no attempts from any side to push for talks or to facilitate talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians. So in the outset, what we can see is a prolonged conflict. I think that is the most probable situation at this point of time. This war is not going to be over anytime soon.
Oh, okay. That's a very depressing thought. Now, Happymon, I asked you a question earlier, but let me rephrase it like this. Given what Stanley has said just now, that the war is, nobody seems to be really interested in bringing this war to a close. We all know that countries like India in the global south will be the first ones to be impacted by any prolonged war anywhere in the world, especially with large commodity producing nations like Ukraine and Russia. So it will be in the interest of these small countries, which are the global south, to actually push for a solution. Do you think that is even possible, given your experience and what you have seen so far? Is there a role India can play, or is there a role some other nation that you have seen is capable of playing?
Thank you, Radhakrishnan. I think let me begin my remarks with one sort of dilemma that I see in global politics today. On the one hand, there is the argument that we cannot allow territorial aggression by great powers. Obviously, I mean we've seen in our own case how China has managed to sort of get aggressive with India on the line of actual control and has captured territory on the LAC. Can we allow, for example, spheres of influence in world politics, which Russia in some ways is trying to do in its neighborhood? It's trying to sort of create a certain sphere of influence and says, the others should not come into that space. A lot of this we have seen in history as well. I mean, there was a time when India would not brook any intervention in India's neighborhood by other powers. So it's not as if this is unheard of in world politics. So this is one part of the dilemma that what do we do when there is the territorial aggression and when countries sort of claim to have a certain sphere of influence that needs to be respected. Should we allow that? Should we accept that? It's difficult to accept that. But on the other hand, there is a need for accepting the reality of world politics, that the world politics, international politics, is not a moral space, as it were. There are great powers, and great powers do what they do from time to time. So there is only so much you can do to control that. So to that extent, I think an understanding of the history of world politics and how great powers interact should also tell us that, listen, this is how world politics functions, right? So I think there is this dilemma about morality versus how things function. I think this is the dilemma that one has to sort of introspect on. Countries like India will have to sort of think deeply about, because if we allow one thing, then it is going to have impact on the other aspect. Anyway, having said that, let me sort of come back to the question that you asked, Radhakrishnan, whether countries like India can play a role, should play a role. It is unfortunate that what is happening at this point of time is that we are, as a country, and I would not blame India for doing that, as a country trying to take advantage of a situation by purchasing cheap oil, and sort of trying to sort of speak things that people want to hear. And different people can interpret those words in different ways. That's what we are actually doing now. From a national interest point of view, that makes a great deal of sense. From if I were a policymaker today, would I have done that? Maybe I would have done that. But as an analyst, as a student of international relations and India's foreign policy, I would say that alone is not enough, because it works in India's favor to sort of take advantage of the situation and sort of try and play this balancing game. But going forward, if, as Stanley pointed out, if this war is going to be there in the longer run, then it's going to have long-running implications for world politics, for poorer countries, for developing countries, and it will have untold miseries for countries like ours, with a billion and close to half population to feed. So I think, therefore, it makes perfect sense for us. There is rationale for us to sort of try and do what we can. And right in the beginning, when Mr. Zelensky asked, President Zelensky did, or I think his ambassador in India did ask for Indian intervention, and Putin is someone who would probably listen to Mr. Modi. India should have made some attempts, and I did argue that myself, in sort of reaching out to the conflicting parties and trying to see what we can do to bring the two sides to a negotiating forum. But I think, unfortunately, if you look at India's history in the 1950s, etc., India would precisely play that kind of a role. But today, India does not play that role. I mean, look at the several years of negotiations on Afghanistan. India was nowhere on the scene. India was not at the table. Look at the conflicts happening in around India's in the neighborhood. Is India part of any of those negotiations? No. So I think that sort of enthusiasm that India should have shown as a major power in the international system should have led it to do something about this conflict as well. But unfortunately, we have sat back. We have We have looked at how this is playing out, and we have tried to take advantage of it. Now, as a policymaker, I would understand why a policymaker would do that, but I think we have to think beyond the immediate and the medium term and at the longer term. And I think India should have done more than what India is doing at this point of time.
Yeah, I'll just follow that up with another question. When did we become this kind of safe player, and what have been the implications because of that?
I think we become a safe player because there is. I think that's because we don't have a grand strategy on how to sort of look at world politics, on how to look at conflicts in the international system, and what India can, as a country, contribute to stabilizing the international system or contributing to world order. We keep asking for a seat at the UN Security Council. We say that we are a major power. We are 1.5 billion people. We want to be at the table, etc. But we haven't really said what we will do when we get that seat at the table. So it's not enough to be big and ask for a space at the table. You also need to know what you want to do with that opportunity. So I think a lot more thinking needs to happen within India, within the South Bloc, or probably within the PMO, etc., on what kind of power India is and what kind of power India wants to be, globally speaking, and what is it that where is it we can contribute, and what we can contribute to stabilize the international system and towards the global order. So I think over time, there was a certain sense during the Nehruvian years, and immediately after that, what kind of a power India is. The non-alignment and all of that sort of stuff that we have for ourselves. But today, we unfortunately talk about strategic autonomy, but beyond that strategic autonomy in some ways is a reactive concept. But from a proactive point of view, do we have a strategy or a concept that is guiding us as a nation in its engagement with the world? I doubt that. So I think it's a conceptual problem. It's an issue that stems from a clear lack of understanding of who we are and what we can do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Happymon. Happymon, thank you so much for your time. I know that you are on a time constraint and you have to be somewhere else. So thank you for your insights on what this means and what roles India should take. And we look forward to meeting you in one of the other spaces soon. So coming back to you, Stanley, just coming back to you, we had this depressing picture. Now somebody wants to ask you, many say de-dollarization, etc., is going to benefit China, which is the real winner in this war without firing a shot. How true is this? I will add my 2 bits to that, Stanley. Now the CCP's conference is coming up. So, and of course, this kind of stalemate and this kind of downturn, wherein China itself has ended up, with a manufacturing projection that did not match what it had, manufacturing actuals which did not match its projection. Do you think CCP will be interested in doing something about this crisis? First, the question of de-dollarization, and then this question of CCP's interest in this whole issue.
So de-dollarization, the whole debate about de-dollarization, I'm not sure where that is headed to, because even I've been hearing about de-dollarization for quite some time, but dollar remains the reserve currency. Even if it loses its status, it is not going to happen anytime soon. So, and also I myself am not an economist, so I'm not going into the specifics of this idea of de-dollarization. But if you look at it from a geopolitical point of view, if you look at the crisis from a Chinese point of view, so I think there is the argument that China could emerge stronger out of this crisis in Europe. I think that is an argument that deserves some merit, which needs to be discussed, because you see so this is with this crisis. When the United States was withdrawing from Afghanistan, the narrative we heard was that after 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the United States left the country, leaving it back to the mercy of the Taliban. But the Americans had to, or they wanted to focus on the Indo-Pacific region, on East Asia, where China was rising fast.
Stanley, Stanley, just 1 minute, because
Yeah.
Happymon would happily take this question on de-dollarization, and then he'll leave. And sorry to interrupt you.
Sure, no problem.
Happymon, please. Yeah.
Sorry, Stanley. I just want to sort of give
no, Happy. Please. Yeah.
2 cents on the whole de-dollarization, debate that's happening. I think the reason why there is a desire among many countries to go in for alternative forms of payment and currencies is because the West has unfortunately used globalization and trade, or weaponized globalization and trade. They have weaponized global trade arrangements such as SWIFT. So there is a lot of conversation that's happening today in various forums, including promoted by China, that we should look for alternative mechanisms. India has been at the receiving end of the weaponization of trade and sort of exchange mechanisms. So this is we've been at the receiving end. So ideally, we should sort of welcome any efforts at alternative mechanisms. So to that extent, one could make the argument that wait a minute, de-dollarization is perhaps a perfect example of let's say multipolarity that we are talking about. But we like multipolarity, but do we like this kind of multipolarity? Well, I'm not so sure about it. Right? I mean, this is not the multipolarity that we wanted. And more importantly, going back to the de-dollarization issue, if there are attempts in the world to sort of look for alternative mechanisms or arrangements other than dollar, the question to ask is who will dominate such attempts? Clearly, China will dominate such attempts. It will be a China-centric payment system. It will be a China-centric. It will be the yuan that is going to dominate, if not dollar. So, while theoretically speaking, multiple arrangements or de-dollarization is a good idea, does yuan becoming stronger or China-led arrangements becoming stronger help India? Definitely not. So I think there are limits to the debate on or the benefits about de-dollarization in that sense. So we like multipolarity, but not this kind of a multipolarity. So careful what you wish for. I leave it at that, Radhakrishnan.
Thank you so much, Happymon. Sorry, Stanley, I interrupted you. Please go on.
But at the same time, yes, I think China will also face the economic impacts of the war. But at the same time, I think China would also like the US or the West to be entirely focused from a strategic point of view on Russia, Ukraine. Because I was talking about the Afghan withdrawal. At that time, the narrative we were hearing was that the United States wanted to focus on East Asia, on the Indo-Pacific region. But that's not happening, right? When Trump was the president, the entire strategic focus of the US administration was on China, on tackling China's rise. But now, what is the strategic priority of the United States? It is to defeat Russia. Biden was talking about regime change in Moscow. Austin was talking about weakening Russia. And the European Union leaders are saying that they would stay committed to Ukraine till the end of the war. So their focus is now, because, it is understandable that they are facing a much bigger strategic challenge in Europe, but their focus is also on Europe. And China is not directly militarily helping Russia, but is buying their oil like what Indians are doing. But I think they have, the heat is now off China as long as this conflict is going on. And this conflict is hurting everybody bad. It is not just Russia. Russia, yes, of course, economically it is going to hurt them bad, because what is the point in having the world's largest gas reserves and if you are not able to sell it to anybody? That's not going to hurt you, definitely. And look at Europe. Europe, I think if the Russian gas supplies are not restored, or if Europe doesn't find alternative energy routes, which is impossible for them to find in a couple of months, Europe's economy is going to be devastated during winter if the war is continuing. The US is also facing the same kind of economic challenges. Midterm elections are coming. Nobody knows what's going to happen to the Democrats. And Europe, you already see the rise of the far right. So this war is going to affect everybody, weaken everybody, while on the other side, on the fringes, China is sitting there and watching the conflict. Yeah, China will also take some economic pressure, definitely. But I think from a strategic point of view, China would emerge stronger out of this conflict.
Okay. Thank you so much, Stanley, and thank you, Happymon, who has already left us. The sense that we are getting at this point of time is that the conflict is no way close to an end, and there is no interest among the international community to actually bring this to a close, given the fact that each country, large and small, is involved in, the global north is involved in its own problems, whether it is a heating issue or whether it is midterm elections or whatnot. And of course, China has an interest in trying to bring this war to a close, but then it does it have the bandwidth to actually do it? Indian interest, as Happy pointed out, has waned since the 50s, since the days of the non-aligned movement. In any case, non-aligned movement exists only in name, if at all, these days. It's definitely in the interest of global south to try and bring about a solution to the crisis, because the worst affected will be the most poor and the vulnerable people in the global south. The global north, as we can see it, the richer countries can always provide. They have enough and more of welfare. Lots of people living on dole, both in Europe and in Canada. Of course, US is a completely different story. But when it comes to the global south, where the majority of the world's population resides, we see more conflicts, we see more hunger, and we see more problems because of rising inflation and rising food prices. So I will leave it at that. And thank you, Stanley, for joining us and staying with us for so long. And thank you, everyone, for participating. See you in other spaces soon. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all.